If you want access to bonus episodes, reading lists for every series of Empire, a chat community, discounts for all the books mentioned in the week's podcast, ad-free listening, and a weekly newsletter, sign up to Empire Club at www.empirepoduk.com. Hello and welcome to Empire. We left the last episode on this cliffhanger with Charles Edward Stuart, Bonnie Prince Charlie, at Glenfinnan on the 19th of August 1745, with the Scots clans massing around him and the sound of the pipes echoing through the Scottish hills as the 45, what the English call the Second Jacobite Rebellion, breaks out in Scotland. This is Empire Pod. I am William Dalrymple.
I'm Anita Arnon. Hello. And we are joined once again by, I think, our epic historian who just took us through a great romp through some really complicated history. Jacqueline Riding, author of Jacobites, is here with us again. And honestly, you create such a stirring image of a young man, let's not forget, in his 20s, who has been abandoned by the people who he should have been able to count on, the French, who've been sort of meddling on tinkering with Jacobite uprisings in the past. But here he is, all alone, buoyed up by this massive sound and this roar of fealty from people who he's never met before, arriving in full sort of Highland gear, not the kilt, though. I mean, just describe what he looks like. What's he wearing?
Because in the Victorian pictures, he's in a kilt which wasn't even in its modern sense invented yet.
It was invented by an Englishman in 1720s, the Philibeg. But he's not wearing that because he's got to ride a horse. When he shifts his kit, if he's marching with his army, he's wearing tartan. He's in formal European dress mode when he's in court. So at Holyrood, as we'll get to Holyrood House later.
So what should we imagine him in the Highlands in when he's just beginning the uprising?
In the Highlands and marching in front of his army, he will be wearing some form of tartan jacket, probably red velvet trousers or breeches, and then obviously knee-length boots if he's riding on horseback. If he's walking, then he'll be wearing something slightly different. He'll also be wearing a bonnet, the blue bonnet with the white cockade.
I should tell a wee story here from my teens. I remember going to see the famous Sir Donald Cameron of Lochiel, who was a great war hero, when I was in my teens. And you go down his drive in the West Highlands, and there's this very, very neat line of trees planted in a perfect avenue. And then suddenly, at a certain point, it stops, and there's this enormous clump of trees all growing higgledy-piggledy all together. And this is the point at which Bonnie Prince Charlie turns up on the Lochiel lands, and Lochiel, who is planting his avenue, drops all the acorns of all the oaks that he's planting on the spot, and all these trees just grow up on the one spot. It's a wonderful sort of moment of you can see everything stops when this uprising breaks out, and it still sort of sits there today, this clump of trees.
The clump of astonishment. I love that story.
It's a lovely image, isn't it?
Yeah. Really lovely. So tell me this, Jacqueline. I mean, when he is there sort of marching ahead of these men who are roaring for him to succeed, he must feel he has a chance. Looking back, how much chance does he really have?
Thing is, until you've absolutely failed, you've got the chance to succeed, if you know what I mean. I know it sounds a stupid answer, but, you know, the momentum's with him. When all those people have gathered at Glenfinnan, you've got about 1,000 or so people, but at least it's more than nothing. And now you've got a head of steam, and he starts to march towards Edinburgh with barely any interruption whatsoever. Because don't forget, while he's doing this in the August and then September of 1745, the British army is still fighting in Flanders in the War of Austrian Succession. They're fighting the French. And they've just started to release people, start to send them back when they're starting to realise that this is more serious than perhaps they thought.
And the future demon of the end of our story, Butcher Cumberland, Stinking Billy, is still on the continent, isn't he?
Yep, and he never wants to come back to do anything in Great Britain. He's very happy being in mainland Europe, fighting the French in Flanders. That's what he's interested in. He's hauled back because the riding becomes increasingly fraught from the kind of British government and the British army.
When do the English begin to hear that there's trouble afoot in Scotland?
They're hearing it all the time. The newspapers are full of it. If you look at a newspaper from 1745, July onwards, the front pages are literally full of what's happening in Scotland, what's happening in the Rising. But people are also fearful in the lowlands of Scotland. They're fearful of this Highland army. This idea of united Scotland at this point it's very far from the truth. You do have this separation between the Highlands and the lowlands, although Charles manages to encourage support from across the Highlands, mainly Highlands, but also lowland Scots as well, do start to come on board by the time he gets to Edinburgh. But Edinburgh, he gets there with very little interruption at all.
Can I ask about some of the clans which have been vilified by other chieftains at this point? I mean, people like the Campbells, for example.
Or indeed the Darimples.
And the Darimples. Where are they in this maelstrom of declaring loyalty to Bonnie Prince Charlie or not?
Oh, they don't. I mean, the Dukes of Argyll are pro-Hanoverian. They're very vehemently anti-Stuart because the Stuarts executed one of their chiefs. So, and Charlie mentions this. Bonnie Prince Charlie actually says, if only my ancestors had been kinder to the Campbells, then maybe we wouldn't have had this vehement, anti-Stuart stance from the Dukes of Argyll and the Campbell
But the Campbells
clan.
are carefully on the west coast, and he marches down the east, doesn't he? And he has an easier passage to Edinburgh.
Exactly. So he lands on the west, but he marches, increasingly gathering troops as he goes along through to the east side to Edinburgh itself. And so, the symbolism, let alone the strategic success of taking over Edinburgh, the capital of Scotland, is extraordinary. Of course, the big question is, does he stay there and simply rule Scotland, or does he carry on marching south towards London? And that's the big question when they arrive in Edinburgh.
And how long do they hover over that question in Edinburgh?
Well, they're in Edinburgh for 2 months.
In the Palace of Holyrood?
In the Palace of Holyrood House. And this is where you have a prince of the Ancien regime, even if he's in a military campaign, will behave like a prince of the Ancien regime. He bought silver in Paris, candelabra, soup spoons, all sorts of stuff, prior to him coming to the Western Highlands, because that's how a prince of the Ancien regime travels. He'd have accoutrement, which includes silverware.
I have to tell you a very sad story about that. My mother's family, I regret to say, also on the government side in this uprising. And it's someone from my mother's family who takes the news of the eventual defeat of this to London. He gets given, as a present for that, Bonnie Prince Charlie's silver canteen. And it remains in my mother's family until a useless uncle of mine, who was a gambler, couldn't find any money at home and picked up something from the sideboard and left it in a pawn shop at Newmarket and literally put the money on the horses and then forgot to go in and pay the pawn shop back and redeem it. It was bought back for the Scottish nation for £5 million a few years ago. And it's now in the National Museum of Scotland. It's a terrible, terrible story.
And that one item is exquisite.
Yep.
Absolutely exquisite.
It's the fanciest camping kit you could ever see. It's a silver travelling set of knives, forks, and little dishes that unfold.
And it could have been yours.
It would never have been mine because I'm the wrong side of the family. But
Okay,
anyway, yeah.
all right. I sometimes feel that during these podcasts, we need a therapist really on hand or on speed dial to talk our way through your family's machinations. So look, in Edinburgh, there he is in Holyrood. He's throwing parties with the requisite silverware. We won't dwell on that because it's painful for some of us. In the meantime, let's talk about the London end of this whole affair. So you have George II, the English Hanoverian king, on the throne.
British,
absolutely right. Tell us a little bit about him. Do us a pen portrait of what he is and who he is and what is he surrounded by while all this is going on.
Well, this is the closest that the Hanoverians get to being dislodged from the throne. I mean, this is both a personal and a dynastic crisis for the Hanoverians. I mean, George II at least spoke some English, unlike his father. The way he's a sort of dour individual.
It's very difficult to get excited about the Hanoverians. Even sort of someone like Andrew Roberts struggles to show an enthusiasm for them.
I mean, the other thing is that in setting up this contrast between Charles and the Hanoverians in London, whether it's the Duke of Cumberland or indeed his father, George II, they are quite a dour bunch. But George II he's a brave individual in the sense that he does lead an army. He's not somebody who just sits in a palace and expects other people to get on with it. He was an enthusiastic, perhaps too enthusiastic, military student. And he wanted to be in the thick of it. He wanted to lead his armies into battle. I think I'm right in saying he's the last British king to lead an army into battle, which was Dettingen during the War of the Austrian Succession. So when the sort of pro-Jacobite propaganda machine whirs up and says he was ready with a yacht next to the Tower of London to escape to his Hanoverian domains, should this get any worse, that's simply not the case. He was firmly rooted in London and would have gone to Finchley Common, the famous subject for the March of the Guards to Finchley by Hogarth. He would have gone to Finchley Common and would have been there with his troops.
So, I mean, there's bravery there. There's a very sort of British jawline. May not be very exciting company and you wouldn't want to look over a candelabra at him, but he's not taking chances either. I mean, am I right in saying that he does place a bounty on Charles's head, £30,000 back in the day, which is about £5 million today, that if anyone could rid me of this troublesome Bonnie Prince Charlie, they will be rich?
Well, I think any self-respecting government would put a bounty on the head of somebody who wants to overturn the government and the dynasty that happens to sit there. I mean, the wonderful thing from kind of the support in Great Britain is that nobody gave him up for that sum of money. That's a sizable sum of money. Nobody ever takes him and surrenders him or tries to surrender him for that.
It is a lovely part of the story that for all the other tragedies, and he's escorted, even when he's lost, out honourably, person to person.
Well, he's still a royal Stuart, even if you consider him the bogeyman. He's the wrong Stuart, the wrong branch of the Stuarts. Nonetheless, he's still royal and he's still a human being. And I think there's an element of that. We'll get on to that later when he's actually sort of scurrying around the Highlands and Islands after the Battle of Culloden. But I think George II, it's difficult to love him, but he embodies the Protestant succession. So regardless of what you think of the individual, if you believe in that succession and you believe in the kings of Great Britain and Ireland should be Protestant, then you're going to support whoever's there, and that's George II.
Now, Jacqueline, the exciting first great battle of the uprising takes place on the 21st of September, beside where I grew up in Prestonpans in East Lothian. Tell us about this battle. My forebears, I should say at this point, play a rather unheroic role and go and sit in a ship in the Firth of Forth to say which way the battle goes.
Yeah, so this, of course, happens just after he arrives in the Palace of Holyrood House. This is within a few days of arrival, so this is quite an extraordinary moment. Some of the troops that have been sent back and some who have been raised, who are recently raised as troops, to march north to get to this area of Scotland in order to fight this Jacobite army, which is starting to gain ground. It's thousands of people. To nip it in the bud is the hope from the Hanoverian point of view.
So they send Johnny Coop.
They sent a very seasoned military general is leading this group of only a few thousand. These are small armies in comparison to the ones that we get used to later, Waterloo, say. Anyway, but they're small armies, but this army is sent there and they start marching towards Edinburgh. And then the Jacobite army...
From Newcastle, I think, isn't it?
Yeah, they march north from there. And then the Jacobite army forms up and starts to march southeast from Edinburgh.
And it's September, it's autumn, and it's a foggy morning.
It's apparently a foggy morning, and the legend and the reality goes that there was some local knowledge about the marshland around
of Dromore.
Yeah, that they are given heads up about certain ways of being able to get through what seems to be an impenetrable boggy land. There's a way of picking your way through it, which is pretty crucial in the context of what happens next. Because what basically happens next is that the Jacobite army is fully ready to fight the British army.
And they come rushing in a surprise attack out of the mist, taking the redcoats by surprise. It's one of the great moments of history.
And of course, this is a style of fighting, this Highland charge, with the sword, the backsword, and the claymores, and it's a style of fighting which is frightening. Because if you ever watch anyone doing reenactments of early 18th and mid 18th century military, they march gradually forward in a sort of line, in a very sort of coherent and sort of a Highland charge. There's an element of organisation, but it is scary. And this, of course, all these troops are watching this for the first time. You don't have fighting between Britons that often, and they see this amazing charge, and most of them flee. So you're running against a sort of fleeing army.
We should paint a picture of this. This is beside the Firth of Forth. It's flat land. You can see the waters of the Forth, if you're in the Jacobites, on your left. And the redcoats are lined up in a thin line, the far side of the bog. And out of this fog mass suddenly come the cry of the Highlanders and the swell of the pipes again. And the English army flees. And Johnny Cope heads off back to Newcastle with his tail behind his, what's the phrase?
Tail between his legs, I think you're trying to say.
The tail between his legs is exactly the words I'm looking for.
I am going to correct you, though.
Oh, no, am I wrong? That's what the song says. Go, Johnny Cope.
He does. He gallops all the way to Berwick. But this army is technically British. Even if there's a lot of English soldiers there, it's technically a British army. And it's not the government army. This is the British army, the King's troops. They swear allegiance to the King of Great Britain. So terminology is quite important.
No, it's fair. And you're very, very right and proper to pick us up on it. I mean, I'm sort of thinking the other reason that well-trained troops might have fled when faced with this, sort of mass coming out of the fog with the noise and the sound is that they've been brought up on stories of the Highlands being full of savages. So for all they know, these are monsters coming at them through the fog because propaganda and as you say, terminology are very, very important. And that's what they've been fed largely.
And of course, a lot of people in the lowlands of Scotland, they remember having Highlanders billeted on them to soften them up, during the course of previous wars and stuff and civil wars and so on. And this certainly becomes an issue when the Highland, which is a predominantly Highland army, but becomes increasingly mixed, Lowlanders, English, as an English regiment and so on. But nonetheless, these are seen as, they speak a different language. They speak what they call Erse or Gaelic. They look different. To the Lowlanders, they are pretty unusual, let alone by the time you get into somewhere like Derby in the middle of the Midlands.
And in front of these, I take it that he's still in front of these wild men from the Highlands, is this beautiful young boy, a Bonnie Prince Charlie, who, by the way, I love this fact, was called Bonnie Prince Charlie in Edinburgh because it was like the arrival of Harry Styles. All the women had heard about his beauty and come out, and that's where the name stuck.
Well, he is incredibly striking. He's an incredibly striking looking individual. He stands shoulders above anybody else. So he's got great presence. And everyone says it, whether they're for or against the Stuarts, they do describe him as this very striking looking individual, which is why the court at Holyrood House, it's not just play acting with your silver and this, that and the other. You're presenting the potential monarchy for Great Britain. You're presenting what he might look like at St. James's as the heir to the throne of Great Britain. This is what he's trying to present. And so the girls falling in love with him is part of this development of loyalty. A lot of Jacobite women encourage their men to fight on behalf of Charles Edward Stuart because they found him alluring, they found him attractive.
Because he's a beautiful, beautiful boy and right is on his side. Can I just ask, is he at the front of that, in Prestonpans and beyond, is he at the front, leading from the front?
No, you don't want your heir killed in a battle. He is the regent to his father, so he's slightly back. He's behind the lines. He's slightly back, but he's not. He's in the thick of it, but not right in the thick of it. He's not charging forward.
Lord George Murray is the general, isn't he, who is in charge of Prestonpans?
Lord George Murray, exactly. He's the sort of another Dur individual, but very committed to the restoration of the Stuarts. Yeah.
So they have this moment in Edinburgh after Prestonpans and after the kind of Harry Styles moment. People are pouring in. Absolutely pouring in from all sides. People that dithers have been on the fence now think this one's going to win. And you have people coming from all over Scotland.
Not as much as they would have liked. I mean, this is still an army of about 6,000. It's still not massive, but bearing in mind the army size at Prestonpans was about 2,000 each. They're small armies, but 6,000 men. By the time they leave Edinburgh at the end of October, beginning of November, 6,000 men and boys can do some damage, that's for sure, particularly if your enemy is still caught on the hop. From Edinburgh, they actually split the army in two to trick the British Army commanders who are looking to see what's going on, trick them to think they could be going either down the east coast or the west coast. And then they rejoin and they come down through the west coast of England. So they actually enter England near Carlisle. That's how they enter England.
So they choose the M5 rather than A1.
And then they start marching down. And of course, Carlisle is a castle with a citadel. But, the walls are collapsing because nobody's had to defend it, in ages. So again, unaware, there was people who knew how to fire a gun, but not a gun that was actually good enough to fire. There was all sorts of things going on. The kind of logistics of it was appalling.
And where's the nearest English army at this point, if they've outwitted them?
Well, they're trying to drag them back from Flanders for a start, and they're starting to form in different parts of the country. And eventually they do a pincer movement towards the advancing Jacobite army. But the thing about the Jacobite army is it's quite light. It's fleet of foot. It's not dragging huge things behind it. It can travel really fast.
Do they have cannon?
They have some cannon, although eventually they start abandoning it. But yes, they do have some cannon. But again, this cannon is quite light. This light, transportable stuff. And as they're going down through the west coast of England, so they go from Carlisle, and you've got places like Penrith.
Rory Stewart's old constituency, you should say.
Exactly. Kendal, they walk through all those towns. They literally go town to town to town.
They stock up on Kendal mint cake.
Exactly. And what was that? And then eventually Manchester, through Ashbourne, and then Derby, all the way. What I found fascinating about doing the book was working with the Royal Archives, the Stuart Archives, and the Cumberland papers at Windsor. And these minute-by-minute notes from people standing in the street and watching this army walk through and trying to work out how many there are and are they well armed? Are they going to carry on? Are they staying the night? Where are they going to go? All these sorts of things are all jotted down into little notes, which are now in the archive. You can just read them, these bits of intelligence, which, of course, if you were caught and you weren't in military kit, you could be executed.
Are these formal spies or people just sending notes on their own basis?
A combination of both. You've got people in the street sort of saying, oh, I was told yesterday by the butcher or the baker or the candlestick maker that X happened yesterday, and I'm just writing this down and sending it to you. The intelligence is coming from all over the place. But this is this thing about going back to the idea that the 45 was doomed. It's not doomed. When you read this intelligence, you're basically watching the worst case scenario from the government in London's point of view is that this is succeeding.
And there's a run on the bank, isn't there? There's a panic.
There's a run on the bank.
And also, Derby's, let's just place Derby for those people who don't live in England. It's only 150 miles from London. They are getting closer and closer and closer. You mentioned before that the French always bide their time before becoming involved because they do things in their interest. They must be watching with enormous interest this extraordinary advance through England by Bonnie Prince Charlie and his Scottish followers.
Well, while he was in Edinburgh in the October, a French ambassador turns up to give him a bit of courage and to give the troops courage to say, look, we are behind you. We're just trying to work out how to do it.
About time the French showed some interest in this.
Yeah, but Charles keeps saying, where are you? Where are you?
Need your money, need your men, need your guns. Where are you? Yeah.
He's trying to keep all his commanders upbeat, but a lot of them are Scottish commanders, like Lord George Murray. He'd much rather stay in Edinburgh and just consolidate their gains in Scotland and just stay put, rule Scotland, don't bother with England, But they're kind of convinced by Charles Edward that the French will turn up eventually in the southeast of England, or they'll deliver things to the northeast of Scotland or wherever it is. And he has to do this because otherwise the whole thing is going to collapse. And they manage to get all the way, he convinces them enough to get them all the way to Derby. As you say, it's between 120, 30, 50 miles from London. It's 5 days fast march to London. And that's where they get to in Derby.
And just again, to emphasise this point, we said there's a run on the bank. People are queuing outside the banks, trying to get their money out of the banks. The banks start giving out the money in pennies, isn't it? Isn't that the story? That in order to slow the withdrawals, they count them out in penny by penny, and the queues are growing outside the banks, and people are screaming. And if only they had known this in the Jacobites, they had better intelligence, they'd have pressed on.
Well, of course, the intelligence would have to get past increasingly a wall of British Army troops, which is now rigging London. I mean, it's obvious where they're going for London. And actually, they could have got to London, in my opinion.
Absolutely, they could. But what happens at Swarkston Bridge? I've been to the spot and sat at this terrible turning point. What happens to make them pause and reevaluate their chances?
They'd already decided the day before. There'd been a council of war in Edinburgh, and people were voicing concern about advancing into England, even in Edinburgh. So that's in the October. By the time you get to Derby, which is in the beginning of December, the dissent is almost universal amongst these commanders. So in actual fact, and the only one of the few people who's actually arguing for an advance to London is, of course, Charles Edward Stuart himself. But guess what? The French still haven't turned up.
Why are the French being so useless?
Well, they actually are. Henry Benedict, Charles's brother, is actually on the northwest coast of France, just like his brother before him, a year before or so. He's there preparing another invasion force, which is about to leave, but it all leaves too late. Or at least the intelligence that is accruing on the northwest coast of France just arrives with the Jacobite army too late.
Is it more contrary winds, or what's the problem?
Well, there's a bit of contrary winds, but actually sheer scale of preparation. Bearing in mind they're fighting a major war across the rest of France. This is all logistics, but there's an element of trying to keep intelligence, to break the intelligence through so that Charles knows for certain that they are waiting for them, that there is going to be this invasion force into the southeast of England, which would have been a game changer.
So the game doesn't change, frustratingly, even though Charles is the one voice saying, we can do this, we can win this, we're on the verge of something really big.
There's panic in London. We can do it, guys.
There's a retreat. Now, tell us about the retreat.
There is some panic going on, and a lot of people had left London because they knew full well this is where they're aiming for and didn't want to be around, didn't want to hang around. At the same time, much like the support for the Jacobites, there was also a support, a rallying of defending London as well, which is where you get the March of the Guards to Finchley, this famous painting by Hogarth. So, for example, they're raising money in the theatres. David Garrick's troupe is raising money to support the defence of London against the Jacobite army and so on.
The Garrick Club's on the wrong side again.
Yeah, but this Finchley gathering, you've mentioned it twice, the Hogarth painting, for those who haven't seen it. So these are just sort of the butcher, the baker, the candlestick maker, everybody rallying to London saying, we will fight them, we will protect London. Is that what that's all about?
Yeah, well, you get people like actors' companies forming up into military companies in order to replace trained regular troops to then march north towards Finchley Common, which is a big area of common land, which is where armies traditionally, whether they're advancing to London or from London, amass on this particular place. And that's where the regular army is going to mass up in order to either advance north or defend London. And that's where George II is intending to go with his equipment and stuff, is to actually go to Finchley Common and be with his troops there. So that's why that's significant.
And Jacqueline, one of the things that had depressed the commanders was perhaps because this army did look so very Scottish, English Jacobites are not flocking to the standard. There is actually, for the last 100 miles towards Derby, almost no one new joins this army, and they feel the hostility of the Midlands people around them. This is not a liberating army being welcomed on. There are dour faces in all the Midlands towns looking at this bunch of tartan-clad Highlanders as they march onwards.
Well, they raise in Manchester, there's a Manchester regiment, and they raise about 300 main Englishmen that come from a variety of places, but mainly Lancashire. And Lancashire, of course, is a strong Catholic county, and a lot of Catholics do join, but also Protestants as well. So this is just about the Stuarts being the rightful kings. Yeah, so it's as simple as that.
But 300 is not a big army.
It's still a regiment. It's the same size as some of the clan regiments, but it's not massive. It's not the full rising they're expecting. What might have put off the English rising is this overt Scottishness, the Highlanders, because even the Manchester regiment wear tartan.
Really? Yeah.
So you're starting to see, well, because it becomes the symbol of this army. The tartan is a kind of unifying thing. Regardless of where you come from, you wear the tartan. And that makes them seem to be more overtly Highland than they actually are. And you're right, they may well have put off the English rising.
But still, even then, even with, they've got one regiment raised, they're still making progress. Why, when, and who is the person who forces the retreat? Because it's certainly, Charlie doesn't want to retreat, does he? Bunny Prince Charlie wants to carry on.
Well, there's a show of hands.
Is it literally that? Hands up, he wants to go on? No, really?
I think the Jacobite Duke of Perth is a gentle soul, was happy to advance with Charles, if that's how the vote would go. But in the main, most sources tell you that, in fact, everybody says no, they want to go back to Scotland. And one of the reasons they want to go back to Scotland is one of the bits of intelligence they are getting is that there's a second Jacobite army forming in the northeast of Scotland under John Drummond. And they decide that either we go back, consolidate, pull this army together in Scotland and then advance again in the spring, because nobody marches an army around any country during the winter. It's an absolute nightmare trying to move an army around in those conditions.
And what is the date they get to Swordston Bridge?
Well, they retreat on the 6th of December. And going back to that bridge, that's a feint. They've already decided they're not going on. They send out an advance party to look like they're advancing. So they get to Swordston Bridge, and that's on the way towards London eventually. That's a feint. That's a military feint. And in fact, they turn around and they all come back. And in fact, the rest of the army is marching north, going exactly the same way, but backwards through where they came, up through Penrith, Carlisle, eventually getting back to Scotland. So that's the significance of that. It is the furthest south they got, but it's a part of the army and it's just a feint.
Well, look, with the retreat in motion, it's a good point to take a break. Join us after the break when we find out, actually, is there any way back? Once you've gone back, is there any way back?
Hey, it's Anthony Scaramucci from the Rest is Politics US. Caddy K and I want to remind you that our mini-series on how Trump won the White House is out right now.
Yeah, we're taking you behind the scenes into one of the wildest presidential campaigns to see just how Donald Trump went from being a famous reality TV star and real estate developer in New York City, to being president of the United States in just 18 short months.
I was there with him the whole time, including on election night when even Trump himself didn't think he was going to win. We're on the campaign trail, accusations of Russian collusion, the introduction of Steve Bannon, Hillary saying Trump supporters can fit in the basket of deplorables, and then the October surprises, the Access Hollywood tape, and the FBI announcement on Hillary's emails. There's so many ups and downs, and we're discussing them all.
So, to give you a little flavor of the series, we've left a clip from this miniseries at the end of this episode for you to enjoy.
Welcome back. So we left the last half with the Jacobite army in retreat. And again, we often look at this with the eyes of hindsight. Historians always regard this as the moment that the Jacobite bottle goes, that their courage fails. And after this, it's just a slow march towards the final terrible battle at Culloden Moor. But that's actually not the case, is it, Jacqueline? There's still fight in the army. There's a sensible strategic reason for them going back to Scotland. There is a new army forming. There's every reason to think the French might send a fleet to Scotland. And in fact, we still have one last victory, don't we? The Battle of Culloden Moor on the 17th of January, 1756, which shows actually what a fast retreat it had been too.
Yes, just when you think all is gloom and doom, they actually do return to Scotland successfully, and they do end up fighting a battle in January, which nobody wants to do, by the way. Nobody wants to fight a battle in January for obvious reasons, but it is a success.
And it's the same thing as Prestonpans, isn't it? It's another Highland charge which immediately breaks the lines of the Redcoats, and they flee.
And a much bigger British army. So this is on a much bigger scale. You have got the troops that have returned from Flanders. So you've got the commanders.
Proper battle-weary troops.
Exactly. These are regular troops, but it's on very strange terrain that they decide to fight on. That's happened. Again, it's slightly done on the hoof from a kind of British army point of view. They are slightly caught out by a sort of cunning advance by the Jacobite army. And this is the second defeat out of two.
And the big difference is, you say, that this is not rookies who've just sort of come through the mist from Newcastle. This is the absolute crack British Army troops. They'd won the Battle of Dettingen, and here they are now finally confronting the Jacobites. And again, there's a Jacobite victory.
Well, the letters from General Hawley, the grovelling letters from him, he's just embarrassing to read, because he's clearly literally caught with his trousers down, because he simply wasn't, I don't know whether he thought that somehow Prestonpans hadn't happened, but he clearly didn't think much of his enemy. And of course, they trip him up as a result. So his grovelling letters to Cumberland, who of course has to be brought back in now, he's disappeared. You know, he's gone off. He's not involved in what's happened since the retreat from Derby, but he's called back in because George II just feels the only person who can sort this out is my son, my second son.
So give us a pen portrait of this man that I was always taught to think of as one of the great sort of stinking figures in history, as one of the brutes and cruel and sort of callous man. Is there truth in that?
Well, his parents would refer to the Duke of Cumberland as Prince William Augustus, third and youngest son of George II. So, I mean, the portraits I've seen, Augustus Gloop comes to mind, a portly fellow with a very unfortunate horse underneath him, because this is not a tiny man, is it? So tell us what
No,
it's
it's
like.
not. I mean, he is the commander of the Allied forces in Flanders. That's partly through dint of him being the son of a king, of course, and also, obviously, the Elector of Hanover. I mean, he is a military man to his core. Now, how good he is as a military man, it depends on who you read, which book you read. Even in the 18th century, it depends on who you're looking at. But he does have the ear of the king. So in that sense, you know, the commanders are very flattering towards him. But George II simply thinks that the only person who can actually deal with this is my own son, the only person I trust now, because Hawley's made such a mess of it. We need to send my son back. The thing about the Duke of Cumberland is that he is a Hanoverian to the core. He doesn't seem to have any off switch when it comes to winning. You know, there's no sense of elegant victory where you might be a little more accommodating towards your enemy or show some mercy. That's not how he rolls.
He's a brute.
He is a brute.
He shoots his prisoners, doesn't he?
You know, he's very fair to his own army, but he seems to have no truck whatsoever with somebody who he considers to be a rebel. A rebel is a traitor, simple as that.
What we might today call terrorists. He regards these people as somehow beyond the pale and therefore not worthy of following the rules of war or the rules of humanitarian conduct.
Yeah, I mean, they are trying to remove my family from the crown, and my job is to get rid of them. So it's as simple as that.
So where does he land, Jacqueline? He's been in Flanders, he's been in command. He takes a ship across, presumably, the Channel. Does he land in London and ride the way up?
Well, he's been in London, and then, of course, he takes command of an army and then marches north, and that's as they're advancing towards Derby. So he's already been in England for several months. I mean, the army disbands or effectively comes back over the October-November. So while Charlie's in Edinburgh, the main army is now coming back from Flanders. Because, there's that thing, it's a bit that politeness of military war in the 18th century. You stop fighting. Everyone agrees to stop fighting because it's winter. And we don't have winter campaigns. So that's when he comes back. So he's been in England for a while.
In the very, very good Jacobite museum on Culloden Moor that the National Trust have set up, you have a very nice set of videos of the different armies manoeuvring around Britain. And you get in that the impression that the Jacobites are very successfully weaving their way around the country, avoiding the government troops and their concentrations. But yet after Falkirk, they continue to retreat to the Highlands. What's in their minds? Is it that they're now in flight, or is it that they think that the Highlands is the place where they'll get support?
Consolidation, to connect up the armies.
I think it's consolidation. They've also they're running out of money. I mean, you've got these various ships that arrive from France, but they've never got enough cash in them. And you've got to pay your army, you've got to pay people. And they're running out. And so they end up in the vicinity of Inverness. And this is where they have this madcap idea of actually printing money, because he's running out of money. He can't pay anybody. So the army, if you're not paid, you have to find food from somewhere. You wander off.
It's not so madcap. It's, in the short term, it's something that could have worked.
It could have worked. And in fact, there's a plate and there's some wonderful printing of these Jacobite notes.
And are printed in Inverness.
And they're printed in Inverness. And the idea is that they're almost like IOU notes, so that when the restoration occurs, you can cash them in after Charles and his father have arrived in London. That's the idea of them. But they're trying to form and consolidate themselves around Inverness. Meanwhile, after Falkirk, you've now got Cumberland has now come back in to Edinburgh as the commander of the troops in Scotland, King's troops in Scotland.
And there is going to be a moment where these two sides face off. He's itching to teach them a lesson. They have some confidence because it's 2-0 so far in the battles. So we are being drawn to the word that people will be familiar with, Culloden. Now, first of all, tell us, where is Culloden? And why is its geography important as well?
Culloden's 5 miles to the east of Inverness. So its significance is because it's a moor, but it's also close to where the Jacobites have been hunkering down and gathering their troops and trying to replenish and raise money, etc. So that's the convenience of it. That's the significance of it from the Jacobites' point of view.
We have an image in our heads of the Highlanders fighting best in sort of mountainous territory, with rather like the Afghan Mujahideen, sort of sitting up on mountains and then coming running down and ambushing people. But Culloden's not like that at all. It's as flat as anywhere in the south of England. It's next to the sea. You can see for miles. It's
flat and it's moorland. You can see the sea on one side. It's such a beautiful aspect when you're at Culloden. You can't really imagine anything horrible happening there, which of course it did. You've got the sea in front of you, and then behind you, you have the slow rising ground. So you do have sort of hills behind you, but it is effectively a flat piece of farmland. And of course, Culloden was owned by a pro-Hanoverian Highlander called Duncan Forbes of Culloden.
A very nice house he has that still stands.
Very nice house he has, and who was a very brave, but also very sort of staunch Highlander, a proud Highlander, but pro-Hanoverian. And this is what I mean, the complications of who the Highlanders were supporting. It is different depending on your background and so on. So Culloden, ironically enough, becomes the site of the battle, which is actually owned as part of the lands of a pro-Hanoverian Highlander.
So take us to the last 24 hours before the battle. Everyone knows the two sides are getting closer to each other. And there is this clever idea, isn't there, that they're going to surprise the government troops, that they're going to leave in the night and they're going to get the government troops and ambush them at Nairn. But that plan goes badly wrong, Jacqueline. Tell us about it.
That's right. So the British Army has been training and acclimatising and waiting for the spring to occur in April. So after all the battles in January and stuff, they've been sort of bedding down in the northeast of Scotland around Aberdeen, and they are rested. Cumberland has also introduced a manoeuvre which is supposed to give heart to his troops, the frontline troops that are facing this Highland charge, which is where you take your bayonet and you shove it towards the right of you, and then the person next to you does the same thing. So you kind of traverse the shield.
So people won't see it coming. Oh, that's interesting.
Most military historians think that was just a kind of a thing that would help to give courage as opposed to a proper manoeuvre that would make any difference whatsoever. It just makes the front line waiting for this charge to come towards you feel a little bit more confident that they've got the support of the people either side of them. And so it's much more about, a sense to keep the line rather than necessarily a manoeuvre that was going to succeed per se. But anyway, he's trained them in this way. He's built up their confidence and stuff like that. And then they eventually arrive at Nairn on the 15th of April. This is where they encamp. So it's the spring, it's April, 15th of April, which happens to be the Duke of Cumberland's 25th birthday.
He's only 25.
He's only 25. God, he looks older.
He's younger than Charles Edward Stuart by a few months.
I mean, I really do urge people to look at paintings from the time. This is a man who has not worn his age lightly. I mean, Lord, he's 25.
Neatly put. But
Right.
Tell us what goes wrong with this night attack, because it's the sort of thing which, again, the whole fate of the country turning on a penny. Had the night attack worked, it could have ambushed the government troops. The whole of history could have been different. But what actually happens?
But also, it's important. It's his birthday. I think this is really important because they are a bit pissed. I mean, aren't they all given 2 gallons of brandy to drink? I mean, to celebrate.
For Georgians, they're not pissed.
Okay, fair point. Okay, but 2 gallons of brandy each, and they weren't pissed.
Each regiment, not each
Okay.
person.
Each regiment, yeah.
That makes more sense. Oh, God, they'd be like poisoned and lying on the ground. Okay, that makes more sense.
Yeah, lots of Georgians are drinking small beer rather than water. So, they've got a light level of inebriation, seems to be the sort of norm. Now, basically, he has dished out some booze for his men in celebration of his birthday. But I suspect they also knew that that's exactly what the Jacobites would know. They would know it was his birthday. They would know he would give a little treat to his troops. There's no expectation per se that the battle will occur on the 16th, the following day. It could happen at any time. All the Jacobites could retreat elsewhere and there's no battle at all. So this idea that there was going to be a battle on the 16th of April is not necessarily the case at all. But they're in with the vicinity of each other now. They are now within the area.
Yeah, Culloden Moor to Nairn is about 6 miles, isn't it, or 7 miles?
Exactly. So they're within hailing distance of each other now. So the idea is that while they're encamped, and Lord George Murray suggests this, he says they're going to be pissed, because it's the Duke of Cumberland's birthday. While they're in their tents, in their beds, we should night march over. So send the troops over and then kill them in their beds. Just kill them. Just snuff them out.
It's a brilliant plan. This is what Clive used to do in India. He used to attack people at night while they were sleeping in their tents, and it always worked. But in this case, it doesn't. Why not?
Well, because they leave too late, because there's arguments. I mean, the trouble is that the Jacobite army, when they're all united behind Charles and thinking, okay, he seems to know what he's doing, it's okay. The cracks aren't appearing. But the minute there's any dissent or any arguments between the commanders, the splits start appearing and you get a separation between the Scots and the Irish commanders. They start to separate. So there's divisions. And so, unfortunately, they didn't leave in a timely fashion. And Lord George Murray later says, he survives the whole thing. And he says, if only we'd left when I'd said.
Yes.
By the time we left, it was too late.
He's right.
And people were exhausted. They were waiting for troops to come back because they were exhausted. They were going off to find food and they were wandering about and stuff. He said, if only they'd all got together and we could have marched in a timely fashion and done exactly what I said we should do. The trouble is we left too late.
And then they don't even get there, do they? They don't get to Nairn. They turn back.
Yeah, they get near enough for the scouts, the British Army scouts, to spot them. They see them coming along, so they get the heads up, and so they send the reports back to the army, the encamped army at Nairn, and then that army then springs to life, forms up and starts marching towards Culloden. Meanwhile, the Jacobite army is having to go back through the rough terrain, exhausted, even more exhausted than they were before.
Because they've been up all night.
They've been up all night. I mean, there's descriptions of Charles and his commanders getting to Culloden House, the famous house, Duncan Forbes' house, collapsing on the bed, and then almost within minutes feeling they had to get back up again because their scouts say the British army's on the move.
And we should also say, it is April. It is wet, it is cold, it is snowing that morning.
Then, even worse, the snow has melted, so it's cluggy ground.
So it's wet, sort of sucking your shoes off kind of terrain that they're walking in.
And the bog is a bog even now. You can lose your shoe in Culloden Moor even with the National Trust in charge.
I mean, the thing is that obviously the day before, there had been reconnoitre across this terrain to work out which was the best place for the Jacobite army to form up. But that's only if you form up in order. The bottom line is they've walked all the way practically on towards Nairn and then walked all the way back again, barely had any sleep. And then the British army has started moving towards them.
And to give a picture of it, there's this bog. There's a few dry stone walls, aren't there, crossing the moor?
Yes, it's part of the park walls of Culloden House itself and then various farmsteads and stuff like that. This is farming land, this is where battles are fought.
When you go there today, it's a very moving sight because they have the cairns erected where the different clans gather. And there's the Macintoshes here and the MacDonalds there. And then on the other side, you've got the straight lines where the Duke of Cumberland is on one wing, Albemarle is on another, and all these generals are forming up in their red coats, with their white epaulets, with their bayonets. And both sides know where each other are. There's absolutely no sense of surprise. It's completely flat ground. And things begin to go wrong from the beginning, don't they? There's one wonderful optimistic charge which breaks one wing, but after that, it's downhill all the way, Jacqueline. Tell us what happens.
Well, of course, the Jacobite army isn't in the position it wanted to be in. So even from the get-go, where they're forming up to face the British army, they are in the wrong place from their point of view. So they're having to improvise. And of course, in the middle of it is this bog. So I think the Jacobites fire first, but the whole thing is done and dusted within an hour.
Which is unusual in the 18th century. Battles can go on for much longer.
Exactly. And there is a spirited Highland charge. They're held back by some of the commanders to hold them back while the firing is occurring from the British army side, which softens up the front line, has to be said. Then they're unleashed to do this Highland charge, but then you've got this bogginess that they end up having to run round and all sorts of things. There is hand-to-hand fighting on the Jacobite right flank, the British army left flank, and people are killed. Some of the British army commanders are killed or maimed.
Bayonets against claymores and...
Exactly. But so that's the hand-to-hand fighting going on there, but that falls back quite quickly because there's a third line, second and third line behind the British army then move forwards.
Properly lined up in proper British army file-firing 18th century mode, stuff they've got really well settled now.
Then the horsemen are sent in who have been breaking down these little walls that are seemingly covering the various flanks, in fact vulnerable. You break the wall down, you've suddenly got access to the rear of the Jacobite army and stuff. So there's all sorts of things going on at the same time, which means that eventually it's fairly clear that there's going to be a rout, and that's what happens.
So I often wonder in the mythologizing of all of this, whether there is an inflation of the number of Bonnie Prince Charlie's supporters who get killed at Culloden. I mean, do we have an idea of how many are killed on his side?
Well, it's difficult to pin down how many people on the Jacobite side were actually there. It certainly wasn't the full army because some of them were still wandering off trying to find food. So this is the trouble. It was a mad assembling of the army.
Then there'd been, even the night before, the Frasers joined the Jacobites. The old fox has been sitting on the old fox is Lord Lovat, the clan chief of the Frasers, my in-law's clan, I should say. And they've been dithering and sitting on the fences. And then they joined the wrong losing side the night before Culloden in a sort of terrible act of self-destruction. So there's some new troops coming in even then. Frasers.
And some of the troops are actually marching along the road towards Culloden, and the other troops are fleeing towards Inverness, because the battle's already happened and everything's collapsing. I think it's hundreds, possibly thousands, and there's certainly on the British Army side, it's closer to, let's say, 100 or several hundred, but obviously killed, but also wounded is a bit more. But most of the casualties are certainly on the Jacobite side by sheer dint of what happens, the collapse of the line, and then the pursuit by the cavalry, which always happens. This is the rout bit of it. If you're running off a battlefield, the battlefield extends as far as the troops get, and the cavalry follow the running figures and just hack them down as they're going along. So you've got bodies lining the road on the way to Inverness. And even into the town itself, there's people who describe cavalry charging into the streets, the cobbled streets of Inverness, with people running and then just hacking at them.
And there's half a plan, isn't there, for the Jacobites to regroup at Ruthven Barracks?
Exactly right, they do. So in fact, it's not all over. And in fact, Culloden was not seen, it was seen as a great victory for the British Army and the Hanoverians, but it was not seen as definitive because you get letters from the Duke of Cumberland saying the very nature of this country is that rebellion will rise up, as soon as anything.
Hang on a minute, but where's Charlie? I mean, if Charlie's still at large, then it's not over. So where is Charlie? What happens to him in all of this?
Well, actually, he's had a horse shot from under him. All sorts of things have gone on. Even though he's not at the front of the army, he is in the thick of it, and he gets mud splattered all over him whenever the grape shot and the kind of cannon fire and all that kind of thing, the shells land. So he's in the thick of it, and eventually it's fairly clear that once the Jacobite front line has broken up and people are starting to flee, it's fairly clear you just can't control an army once it's started doing that. So it's all up for now. So he says he insisted on standing still, and other people say this too. Someone grabs the reins of his horse and drags him off the battlefield, because if he goes, then the whole cause is done.
That's it. As long as he's alive, there's still something. Yeah.
The trouble is, though, he then escapes with a few 100 or maybe 50 people, escort him off the battlefield. They end up wandering around. The rest of them have been told by, I think it must have been Lord George Murray, tells them to meet at that barracks.
Reuvenglad, which still stands. If you go up the A9, you can see it on the right.
Exactly. Several thousand Jacobite soldiers gather 30 miles south of Culloden at the barracks.
And they wait for Charlie to come, and he doesn't.
That's right. And he doesn't come, and eventually there's a signal sent to say just every man for himself.
So from the minute of the defeat, Butcher Cumberland shows himself at his true self. No prisoners are left alive, are they? They slaughter the prisoners. Anyone wounded on the battlefield is bayoneted. There's absolutely no mercy shown to any of the Highlanders from that moment.
Well, prisoners are taken, but parts of the British Army do return to the battlefield, and you do get examples of people being killed on the battlefield who are just wounded. So in other words, wounded people are not being taken.
There's a barn at the back of Culloden where the Jacobites have put a lot of their wounded, and all that lot are bayoneted within an hour of the defeat.
Yes, this is where the butcher element comes in. This is definitely where it comes in. There is a print which shows a bullock or a bull, a kind of calf, standing on his hind legs holding an axe, who's a butcher's axe. And it's got the star of the Order of the Garter on it. And this is the butcher. And that starts the ball rolling back in London in regard to this nickname, the Butcher. That's how they instigated. And they talk about him becoming a freeman of one of the guilds in London. And they say, well, let it be the Butcher, the Butcher's Guild. So that's where that starts.
Okay, but big question. I mean, all of this horror is going on. Where's Charlie? Where is Charlie? So, I mean, there is a lovely story, a romantic story. Is it a true story about a young woman called Flora MacDonald, who is his salvation? Tell us about that story. The myth and the reality, I suppose, or are they the same in this case?
Well, she meets him for 2 days out of 5 months.
Okay, but we should say who she is. She's stepdaughter, fiancée of 2 officers in George's army. I mean, she's kind of star-crossed in that respect because she shouldn't be on his side. She should be the person who's shopping him to the authorities, but she doesn't. What does she do instead? She
supports him, partly because of the human thing about a person who's been hunted. That 30,000 still hanging over his head, that bounty is still hanging over his head. So there is that thing about Highland hospitality and stuff. She's also fearful about her own clan chief, the MacDonald clan chief, because he's kept out of it. He kept out of the 45. So she's quite ambivalent about what to do when she's asked to help Charlie. And how she helps him, though, she does agree in the end, is that she pretends that Charles is her maid, an Irish maid called Betty Burke. And so Charles, who's 5'10", which is very tall, 5'11", 5'10", in his stocking feet, is then dressed as a woman in a full gown, a mop cap, the whole shebang. And this Betty Burke, who's Charlie, escorts his mistress, Flora MacDonald, and she takes him on a boat. This is the famous Skyboat song.
Over the Sea to Sky.
Over the Sea to Sky, but dressed the whole time initially as a woman.
Song doesn't mention that, by the way. Song doesn't mention the cross-dressing.
Cross-dressing moment.
No, she gets into a safer place dressed as a woman. But this is only 2 days out of 5 months of him being a fugitive. So he has a terrible time. But weirdly enough, he starts off moaning about the midges and moaning about what terrible food he's being given and stuff like that.
Well, if you've been to Skye, I mean, the midges, he has a point, to be honest. They are awful on Skye. Yeah.
But eventually, people describe him as having a lovely auburn beard and his hair, and he's wearing the full kit.
Oh, he is pretty.
It's an unusual Irish maid.
Irish maid. Betty's got a beard.
Not wearing the dress anymore. But after the 5 months, he starts to get used, because he knows how to shoot. He's a crack huntsman. You know, he knows how to ride. He's used to being out in terrain, hunting and stuff like that. So he almost comes into his own, curiously. And he ends up dressed in plaid, almost like a Highland chief. That's what he looks like, with his wonderful red hair, his auburn hair and stuff. And he starts to sort of slip into the life, as it were. But the whole time being a fugitive. You know, he's running away from people who want to either capture him or kill him.
But she gets him to Skye, he makes it to Portree, and then from there they get a boat to Raasay, don't they? The island of Raasay.
That's right. But then that continues the whole escapade around hopping from island to island, back to the mainland, back to the island.
And eventually off to France.
Eventually, yeah.
Yes, but were they in love and did they do it? I mean, I'm sorry, but you're just skirting
The
around
answer's no.
Okay, just want to know, because that's one of the,
Anita.
it's one of the great love stories.
They hardly knew each other.
Not at all, okay.
It's the story of Highlands hospitality.
Just wanted to clarify, because, in the film version in my head, there was a great love affair and a great deal of daring do involved, but as you were.
I mean, she is arrested for her part in that, and she's taken to the Tower of London, which isn't quite as bad. If you've been to the Tower of London, you know it's not quite as bad as that sounds. But she's under house arrest, but eventually becomes this great heroine and painted by loads of portrait painters and stuff like that, and very much a star and a Jacobite heroine. But she does survive the encounter.
But others are not so lucky as Bonnie Prince Charlie. He makes his escape to Raasay and off to the continent. But meanwhile, there is blood and retribution across the Highland. The Highland clans are sequestered. The tartan is banned. The pipes are banned. The redcoats are let loose on all the villages. People are bayoneted. And Butcher Cumberland is forever known after this as one of the cruelest of all English commanders. New English forts spring up across the Highlands like Fort George. And this is what, in a sense, will prime us for the rest of this series, because at this point, all sort of options for Highlanders and many Scots are reduced by this defeat. And many Scots will now be looking to the wider horizons, whether it's emigration to America, whether it's a new career in the Caribbean, or particularly a new career in India. And we will see in the episodes that come that many of those who fought at Culloden will meet again. Just to give a little hint of that, the man who trains Robert Clive, who gives him the military knowledge that allows Clive to win Plassey, is Stringer Lawrence, who was on the government side in Culloden. And the French commander that he's facing in Pondicherry had also been in the Jacobite rebellion on Bonnie Prince Charlie's side. So this is a crucial turning point in Scots history, and one which will lead us on to the rest of our series of Scotland and Empire.
Yeah, and then you've done a wonderful job of actually showing how this is part of a much, much bigger picture. We're so grateful. The historian Jacqueline Riding, author of Jacobites, A New History of the 45 Rebellion, but more recently, Hogarth, Life in Progress. And you've heard Hogarth mentioned by Jacqueline a couple of times during these two podcasts. And she also runs something very exciting she was telling me about. It's like a Jacobite support group, Jacobite Studies Trust, where anybody who's interested in this period of history can join. Is it anybody, Jacqueline?
Yes, so there'll be details on the website for the Jacobite Studies Trust, but we have these regular seminars where interested folk can listen to somebody just talking about their most recent research, and people who know a lot more than I do about Scottish, Irish elements of Jacobitism. Some wonderful stuff is being done in recent scholarship and so on. And yes, it's a community we're trying to expand, so all welcome.
We should end, as we've mentioned, Jacqueline's fantastic book on Hogarth, with the fact that Hogarth is very much around at this time, and he makes a famous painting of the old fox, Lord Lovat, who had joined the Jacobite army on the last night before Culloden, and immediately then is arrested. And there's a famous story that Hogarth tells about Lord Lovat going off from the Tower of London for execution, along with other Jacobites. And as he's being taken through the crowd to the place of execution, a woman jeers at him, "You're going to have your head cut off, you ugly old Scottish dog." And he replies with perfect composure, I believe I shall, you ugly old English bitch.
Stirring words on which to end this podcast. Jacqueline, thank you very much indeed. Till the next time we meet, it is goodbye from me, Anita Arnon.
And goodbye from me, William Dalrymple.
Hi there, Catty here from The Rest is Politics US. Here's the clip I mentioned earlier from our series on how Trump won the White House.
We're mapping her. Okay, where are we going today? Well, we're going to Wisconsin. We're going to be in Michigan. We're going to fly to New Hampshire. Then we're going back to LaGuardia.
And he really would do that many stops in one day.
100%.
He would do three rallies in one day.
I could show you the grid. Okay, and then where's she going? No place. Nowhere. Where's she going? Is she going to Wisconsin? No. Is she going to Pennsylvania? No. Why are they doing this? What are they doing? So it was either a health issue for her. It was either complacency and cockiness on the campaign. It was either they really believed the blue wall, or maybe she thought she was Joe Biden. Maybe she thought she had Joe Biden's blue-collar presence in those areas. But after the deplorable speech, the fact that she's not moving around the country to repair that, we found astonishing on our side. To hear the full series, just search The Rest is Politics US wherever you get your podcasts.